Hi, and welcome to the Reclamation Project podcast. We are so glad that you're here, that you're listening, and hopefully that you're a part of the conversation. Today, we are continuing our conversation on attitude adjustments, and we've gone through attitude adjustments talking about how to live our life better, more eternal focused than reality focused. We've also talked about being humble and meek and teachable. We've also talked about mourning and just how to have a righteous frustration and anger for things that are unjust. And today we are going into and talking about how to be merciful, how to have mercy on people around us. And I think this is a big topic for where we are today as a society. I mean, when you really think about it, there are a lot of people who don't have mercy on each other. Instead, they fight and they claw and they have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth mentality, where they want vengeance and they want to see other people hurt as much as they've been hurt by them. And so that's really what we're talking about, is how do we have mercy on people in the midst of all of that? And let me just interject here. As we've been talking about these things, these are principles for everyone, whether you have a faith-based background or foundation, whether you've been raised in the church, whether you believe in God or not. I think all these principles that we've been talking about are ones that everyone needs to hear. And so hopefully you don't tune out and turn off to this discussion if you don't have a faith-based foundation. Hopefully this spurs you on to live a better life. And hopefully if you're a Christian, this spurs you on to a better relationship with God as we hopefully implement this principle into our lives. So we're talking about mercy today again. And so let's just dive into that. What does it mean to be merciful? The Bible says, "Blessed are those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy." So what does that mean? How does that look? How does that feel? How can we show mercy to one another?
You know, when we were going to do this, I thought, this will be an easy one. Then I had to do some self-checking and realize that my mercy is somewhat selective. And I, especially when it runs headlong into my biases, as if my bias of what I believe, theologically, politically, whatever. So I thought this would be an easy one. And so I really had to do a lot of look at what mercy is. And I think probably the best explanation is mercy is kind of a combination of two words, empathy and compassion. So empathy really comes from the two words, em being inside and pathos, which is suffering. So empathy really means to go inside of someone else's suffering. And that's hard to do. And then compassion really comes from kind of one of the same last words, com being the word with or alongside, and pathos being suffering. So I can either have empathy and go inside and be a part of someone's suffering, or walk alongside them, compassion. And I think that comes into play with when you're extending mercy. If you really know someone, if you've spent some time walking in their shoes, feeling their pain, empathy, or just come alongside them on the journey, and compassion, it's a lot easier to extend mercy. I think what we're going to find in our discussion here is why mercy is so hard, because like everything we've talked about, it really comes on a relationship based. If I don't know someone, I could probably be more apt to not giving mercy. Someone I know, someone close, we were kind of talking off air about some people we know, and when something strikes on a family basis, the same thing we had no mercy with across the room. Now a child, an aunt, an uncle, someone committed the same offense, we're more apt to give mercy. So I think this is going to be a good discussion as we look at how do we make mercy an everyday part of this spiritual journey, because I know I certainly need an attitude adjustment when it comes to some of this.
Yeah, and I'd also say that along with empathy and compassion, another component that it comes with is forgiveness.
Yeah.
And it's hard to forgive people. I mean, when people wrong you, when people say something that just cuts to the bone of who you are, it's hard to give them forgiveness. It's hard to give them compassion, empathy, mercy. When you're around them, you want nothing to do with them. That is a very I think to a certain extent, natural part of being human is you want to defend yourself from the hurt and the pain that they bring to you, whether it be verbal or physical or emotional pain or spiritual pain even. You want to defend yourself from that, and you want to keep that blow from hitting so hard and cutting to the core. And a lot of times, forgiveness is the complete opposite end of the spectrum for that. Forgiving someone for what they've done is opposite of defending yourself from them. You look on any social media and you see people who, when someone hurts them or hurts someone around them, they go on the offensive. They just go after that person. And mercy is the opposite of that, complete opposite of that we need to start with maybe forgiving them, humbling ourselves to them, and not going back on the offensive and having that eye for the eye, tooth for a tooth mentality, where we want them to suffer as much as they've made us suffer.
And part of that is unforgiveness or the lack of showing mercy. Is if we show mercy to someone who, quote unquote, I just did air quotes for all you listening at home, if we were to show mercy to someone who didn't ask forgiveness or isn't deserving of it, then we condone the behavior, or they get away with everything. And that is just opposite of what it is about mercy. In fact, I like the verses in Romans where it says, when we were enemies with God, when we were enemies with him, he showed us mercy, which, by the way, goes back to the word empathy. He came inside our suffering and didn't look at it from above. He clothed himself in flesh and entered into an empathetic, he did the journey on the planet with us, entered into a compassionate relationship. And because of that, we cry out, oh, God, give us mercy. And because he's loving, he grants us mercy even when we just don't deserve it.
Well, and he shows us what that looks like, whether it be the person in the garden, who was arresting him, and Peter kind of is the perfect example of what we do nowadays, which is he lunges at that guy with the sword and cuts off his ear.
I like Peter.
Yeah, and what's Jesus do? Jesus tells Peter to put his sword away, right? He's getting beaten, he's getting flogged, and he's getting mocked on the cross. And what's he say? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect example, and Christ shows us throughout his entire life of how he deals with people, of how to have mercy, how to have compassion, how to have righteous anger too. It's not just, hey, keep swinging and I'm gonna just take everything, but he has righteous anger about things that hurt people, that are unjust, things like that. And you can go back to our previous podcast on mourning when we talk about that. But he shows us the humility, the mercy in the sight of being hurt, of being put in a painful state, of being mocked. He shows us what that looks like when he asks God to forgive them. And in the same way, he probably he did forgive us as we did the same thing, as we've done the same thing in our lives.
Even in the grace movement over the last 10, 12 years that really just seemed to sweep over the church, we've taken mercy and kind of misjudged it too, as if mercy means no accountability. It's just a blanket forgiveness. But I was having a discussion the other day with a guy. We were talking about the death penalty. I got to find people I can just talk about sports, because we talk about too much heavy things. And so I was talking about, so you give a guy life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. That's a show of mercy. I didn't let him go free. To let a convicted criminal go free would not be mercy. That might be ignorance. But I could still show mercy in the context of what it means to be a peacemaker, which we'll probably talk about on our next podcast. So, I think if we show mercy, then we let people off. Sometimes showing mercy is punishment in a loving way. Because if I just don't want, your child goes for the stove, and on top of the stove there's this pretty red disc. It's almost orange, and they just want to touch it. So you grab their hand, and a merciful father grabs the hand and kind of gives it a nice smack and says, "Don't touch that. This is painful." That's not a mean gesture. That's actually a merciful gesture. So I think when we talk about any terms in this attitude adjustment series, we really need to define the terms in more than just our traditional theological ways we grow up, but more of a broader context where mercy is really another way we show love.
And one of my favorite verses that I've read in the last couple of weeks is found in Luke 6, verse 27. As we talk about mercy as love, we see Jesus talking, and he says, "But if you are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for happiness of those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give what you have to anyone who asks for it. And when things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. Do for others as you would like them to do to you." In verse 32, it says, "Do you deserve credit merely for loving those who love you? Even sinners do that. And if you do good only to those who do good for you, is that so wonderful? Even sinners do that much. And if you lend money only to those who can repay you, what good is that? Even sinners will lend to their own kind for a full return." In 35, it says, "For love your enemies, do good to them, lend to them, and don't be concerned that they may not repay. Then your reward will be in heaven. Your reward in heaven will be great, and you will truly be acting as children of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and to those who are wicked. You must be," and the NIV says, "merciful, just as your Father is merciful." The NLT says, "You must be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate." And I think that's a perfect example of what Jesus is saying in Matthew 5 when he says, "Blessed are those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy." Is we are supposed to love not based off of if it's easy, we're supposed to be merciful not based off of if it's easy. We're supposed to be merciful not to those people that just act the way that we want them to, who we feel are going to feel sorry for these when we show them mercy, but we're supposed to be merciful and love people despite what their reaction to that love and that mercy and that compassion, that empathy might be. And I think that's very hard. That's a humbling concept.
Well, I think what those verses tell me is my mercy and grace has been selective. And that's why, we read that and it says, "Blessed is he who show mercy, they will receive it," as if it was a reward. Again, it's amazing how some of our old Baptist traditions, we could turn even a verse about grace and mercy into a legalistic, follow the rule. In other words, if I want mercy, I have to show mercy. And I don't think that is in touch with the thought of what he was saying there. The thought is I have a much better likelihood of receiving mercy when I'm merciful. I was watching an old Western movie. I love on Saturdays you can get on the old Western channel, and I don't remember what it was. It was a John Wayne movie. I think it was Big Jake. I'm not even sure what it was now. Yeah, it was Big Jake. Well, anyway, in the context of the movie, there was a robbery, and the guy helped the robber out, and he said thanks. He ran away. So as the robber comes back to decimate the city, he sees the guy that helped him, and he let him go. Get out of here. I'm about ready to cause some havoc in the town. And so because he showed mercy, he received mercy. Not a theological description or analogy, but I think you get the point that it's not show mercy and you'll get mercy as if it's a program. I stick something in the mercy change machine and I get out so much mercy. It's about how you live your life, not selectively. I'll give mercy to my kids that I wouldn't give my next door neighbor, and I don't think that's consistent with the attitude adjustment Christ is trying to tell us to have in this verse.
Well, and I think it's easy even in today's age, and in the United States where we're at, right? It's easy to show forgiveness for someone's faults, to almost sweep them under the rug if they have the same political slant that you do. If someone has an R next to their name, it's easier to be like, oh, well, he's doing good for the country. We can let this one go. But if they have a D next to their name, they're going to hell.
Yeah.
And
vice versa.
And vice versa. I mean, it's the same whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's very easy to be okay with things and be merciful towards things if they have that same political ideology. But we're not as merciful with the other side.
Yeah.
We're not as merciful. I on the other end of the spectrum, I see people who were very very forgiving and merciful towards our last president and his faults versus our new president and his faults.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's very easy to forgive those people who you identify with to a certain extent, who you who think the same way you do, who look the same way you do, who come from the same kind of background or have the same ideas that you do, and it's easy to forgive someone like that rather than the person who doesn't look as wonderful and as much like a mirror image to you as these other people.
Yeah.
So I think we need to be very careful that mercy is for everyone.
Absolutely.
And mercy is for the person who's attacked you 20 times and for the person who's wronged you once.
Yeah.
And that's a freaking hard thing to do.
It is, and it's almost not fair, except it's biblical, so it must be fair. I was sitting with a married couple this week, and we were talking about they're struggling. They fight a lot, and I had to help them identify one thing. So I said, listen, you have to have the same rules. And as I looked at the husband, who really was where the bent was going, I said, so in your marriage, when you screw up, you want grace and mercy. When she screws up, you want judgment. You can't do that. It has to be at the same playing field. And I think that's probably exactly what you were saying. It's we have our bents and our favorites of who we want to give mercy, or more increase the likelihood of giving mercy to someone that agrees with me, looks like me, related to me. I think the attitude adjustment is when I can give mercy to someone who is not all of those, and maybe even against me, which Romans says that, we were his enemies. When we were his enemies, which means in our sinful nature, we hated God. He showed us mercy, came down and clothed himself in flesh, empathy, and walked the journey with us, compassion. And it's that same mercy we call. He didn't have to show it, but I think that's the attitude adjustment Christ is kind of leaning to in the Beatitudes here.
Yeah. I mean, he tells us in Luke, love your enemies, turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
If later on in Scripture, he says, if someone asks you to go 1 mile, go 2.
Yeah.
It's who we're supposed to be. Is we're supposed to humble ourselves and be merciful. And it's funny, as you were talking about how it's easy, one spouse wants mercy and then judges the other. Yep. I think that's a lot of where Christ came from when he said, hey, you know what? Don't look at the speck in your brother's eye, look at the log in your own.
Yeah.
I think a lot of mercy comes with that humility of knowing that you're not perfect either, and that your words can cut to the bone just as much as their words can cut to the bone. So with that said, I think we need to forgive, humble ourselves, and show mercy towards others, even though they haven't even asked for it.
I keep going back to that word empathy, because I think that is like the driving force behind mercy. I sit with people, clients, and people that maybe went to the church where I used to pastor, after they've gone through something difficult, a cancer diagnosis or something, and I might have referred to her back a few podcasts ago, but a lady who just found out that morning we met that she was in remission with cancer. And I asked her, what did cancer teach you that nothing else could have? And she thought for a minute and she smiled. She said to be kinder to people. She goes, if I was in a grocery store and someone was rude, I would just walk away and think about how awful that person was, until I'm coming home from my chemo and I pull into a store and I'm rude. And so she said, it causes me to look at, I don't know why this person is rude. I can forgive that. Maybe they just got a cancer diagnosis. Maybe their husband left them. A plethora of scenarios you could paint, but if I'm willing to give mercy, which means I have to give up my right to be right or my right to be even. That's probably where I struggle. And I was talking about with my wife this podcast we were going to be talking about right now, mercy. I said, I think I'm a pretty merciful guy, except on the freeway. I don't know why I turn into Charles Manson and Attila the Hun on the cut me off, and I don't have much mercy. I don't know what that is, Jeremy. Maybe I need some psychoanalysis over there. But you're right. I mean, to your point is we can't be selective in mercy. The attitude adjustment is mercy should be consistent part of who we are in this journey.
And to kind of double down on that, the story that you just told, the same thing happened to me recently. Is my shoulder has been I've had rotator cuff tendonitis, or at least that's what they tell me. And my shoulder has had so much pain over last year. And I've noticed, and I was actually just talking to someone about this the other day at work, is I've noticed when the pain is just immense and I can feel the pain creeping up my neck because all of this shoulder works together in with your neck muscles and nerves and all that stuff. And I can tell you right now, it's on fire as I'm standing here talking. But I told them, what I've noticed is there's people in my life that I've always wondered why they're grumpy, they're frustrated all the time, why they just have a opposite of sunny disposition. And now that I'm going through this pain, I see why. Because there's been times where I've just been in immense pain, and I come home and my kids want to play, and my wife wants me to do things, and I am just a jerk, because I just can't deal with the pain. And I was talking to someone the other day about this because they're going through a similar thing, and said, it's amazing to me how much I've realized that the people that I've come in contact with that are grumpy, that are hurting, that have this disposition and deserve the mercy, why they are the way that they are is because they're going through that pain on a daily basis that is way more than what my shoulder is, and I can understand that more. And not only that, that's just physical pain. Now let's talk about emotional pain that people go through. And you realize why the world is the way that it is.
Absolutely.
Is because they are hurting emotionally, spiritually, physically, and that pain is causing their disposition to be the way that it is.
No, I totally agree with that. My premise is always, I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and says, how can I be a complete jackass today? How can I be the meanest, most obstinate person? So if I run into that person, I as we like to give takeaways, and maybe this is one you could chalk up in the takeaway about how do I increase my likelihood of giving out mercy. But when I see someone like that who's increasingly mean-spirited or rude, or I always make a beeline to them, and I think I want to know what's going on. I'll sit and talk. I'll ask them some questions. Usually, you'll get the real answer in a few minutes, because they didn't wake up to say I am just going to be a jerk today. So when they're a jerk, I have to think there's pain, physical, emotional, mental, somewhere in there. And maybe, just maybe, this is why our paths cross today. It's easy to sit next to the guy at Starbucks who's smiling, laughing, and actually paid for your latte. And it's a little tougher to be by the guy who cut in front of you and called you a name under his breath. So I'm not asking you to go out and look for those people. I'm asking you at that moment that you encounter someone like that to remember the attitude adjustment of mercy. Let's find out where this guy's jerkness comes from. I just made up another word for you at home. Where did this mean spirit come from? So let me ask you, Jeremy. So when your shoulder's painful and you had a rough day, when you go home, what is it you want? Do you have peace and quiet? Do you want some sympathy? What would make you feel good at that point?
I want an ice pack, an Advil, and I just want to lay down.
Yeah.
And that's difficult with small children.
Yeah.
As they want to be running around, and God bless my wife. She is amazing. Yeah. She has had, and I've said this on a previous podcast, is she has had incredible back pain since she was 13, so 17 years now. And she has a fused spine. She has rods in her back, and she goes through pain every single day. And I sit there and I'm icing my shoulder, seeing her playing with the kids. And I'm like, I'm the biggest jerk in the world, because she's going through pain too. And I know that I need to be to her what she's being to me more than I do, because sometimes I need to suck it up and do things for her so that she can sit and rest and ice as well.
Yeah.
We're two old people with two little kids. It feels like we have 80-year-old bodies. But yeah, that's what I want. I want peace. I want time to myself to sit down and recover from the day. Give
me a little compassion. And so when I think about the end benefits of giving mercy, I think about when my daughter who passed was in the hospital and I had to drop out of Bible college. Someone in the Bible college said, we don't like quitters. I said, I'm not quitting. I'm just taking a semester off. And then when she passed away, he came to my house and said, don't you think maybe God took your daughter because you quit Bible college? Now, I was too into understanding authority and kind of afraid of authority. It's a good thing he didn't say that to the older Gary now, but the younger Gary was very respectful. But I carried that brick in my wagon for a lot of years. It was some unforgiveness and some anger because of the guilt it continually produced in me too. And it was just a couple years ago. So we're talking about 20 years. I carried this brick in my wagon. I was sitting in a Starbucks, and I was thinking through it, and I had to think, what was his intentions here? Well, and first of all, I'm thinking, this is 20-something years later. Why am I still thinking about it? And I came to the conclusion he wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe he was trying to help me make sense. It didn't work. But I forgave him for that and said I don't think he was trying to hurt me, so he probably did the best he can. And I extended forgiveness and mercy, and it was done. 2 weeks later, his son, who's a pastor here in the valley, saw me and said, I have a weird question for you. Did my father say this? And I said, I can't confirm nor deny that he said this. He goes, I thought so. I want to ask forgiveness in his behalf. The moral to the story is, once I gave out mercy and forgiveness, the brick comes out of your wagon. I don't carry that anymore. I don't think about it. I'm not wounded by it anymore. I don't use it as an excuse anymore. So I think that's part of that end of the verse where he says, when you give mercy, you receive it. When I forgave him, it took the brick off my wagon. That sure feels like a merciful thing that's happened to me.
Well, when we talk about how people hurt physically and they have those dispositions that aren't great, when you hold on to something like that, where you haven't given mercy, haven't given forgiveness, you in the same way, you have that affects your psyche, your day to day.
Yep.
Maybe if it's something that's 20 years ago, maybe it doesn't, affect your day to day, but it might creep up every month.
Oh yeah.
It might creep up every once in a while, and it might impact who you are. So I think it's good to unload and give mercy to those things that you've been holding on to for a while. And to a certain respect, that's what I have to do to myself. Is I have to forgive myself for
Great
things
point.
that I've done.
That's a great
I
point.
have to accept mercy, and that's the hardest thing.
Yeah.
And we talked about this a little bit before off air, Gary, but I think one of the hardest things to do is to give yourself mercy, to give yourself forgiveness, to accept it from yourself and accept it from others. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
To do, because at least for people like me who are more introspective and more I guess we sit there and fester on things, is it's difficult for us to receive that because we are constantly going back to that.
Yeah.
And we're constantly festering on it and wishing that we didn't do it, and wishing that we could have an end to what we're thinking about. I don't know if that makes sense to other people, but that makes sense to me.
Well, yeah, like how am I going to accept someone's forgiveness if I can't forgive myself? It just kind of it bashes against that wall. In the counseling world or the psychology world, they call that power. So once you give out mercy and you release that through forgiveness or empathy or compassion, it takes the power away. So the minute I forgave him in that Starbucks, I mean, the metaphor was he took the brick out of my wagon, but that still had power over me for 20 years. And once mercy was exercised, I received mercy. Again, I didn't do it to receive that, as a legalist would tell you. That's what that verse is saying. But I think when you extend mercy, you'll see mercy. And I think that's an exciting certainly an attitude adjustment for me this week. And I know how things go. I know I was tested as I was reading, kind of studying for today's podcast. This was a bad week. I think I met every jerk in the East Valley, and I think it takes every jerk to make me understand that I really had to dig down into my big bag of mercy this week. But it was good. And you know what I didn't do this week? I didn't take home a bunch of junk. Yeah. So I love this attitude adjustment, and I want to make sure it's not just for the week of the podcast. It's something that I continually practice as I move forward.
And just like you saw and heard from every jerk in the East Valley, I feel like this week that in another way, God's shown me and continue to show me this week things that I've done and have had in my past that I haven't worked through, processed through, felt mercy on, and that's made me feel like the biggest jerk in the valley as well. And it's been a tough week for me for that reason too, is because I haven't accepted that forgiveness. Mm-hmm. I haven't forgiven myself. I haven't accepted that mercy. I haven't had other people forgive me, and for those things, mostly because I'm not in contact with them anymore. But I think of things that I've said to people. As you've had this guy say this to you 20 years ago, I wonder what I've said to people that may have, burdened them as well. And so as I've been running through and feeling this and working through my own junk, it's made me feel like crap, knowing that I haven't accepted that mercy. I haven't accepted that forgiveness from myself or from anyone else.
When you do that, when you replay those kind of things, because I think we're all guilty of that. I was sitting with a young girl this week, and we were talking about a similar thing that she keeps reminding herself of and can't accept the forgiveness. So I read this verse to her, and it's one of the few times I'll actually go to the King James unless I try to make myself laugh. Sorry for you King James only people. That's how I grew up. But it's talked about in Hebrews 6. It says, if they shall fall away, to renew them again unto repentance, seeing that they crucify themselves and the Son of God afresh every day. I was letting her know, because as she's really coming to her a good place in her faith and her walk, I said, but your lack of forgiveness, and then every day asking forgiveness for the same thing, or the refusal to do that, is like crucifying Christ every day. And she goes, well, I wouldn't want to do that. And I said, no. And so it really, at that point, it really does come from a perspective. I always like to say, I think the hardest thing people deal with is their view of God's view of them. And those are the things they wrestle with. And so I think if we could, one of the ways through this thing, what you're talking about, Jeremy, is forgiving yourself. And let me read something to you from the Message. And I don't know, some people like it. It's a good, actually I like it. I think sometimes it really nails the thought. And if you don't mind, Jeremy, I'm going to do a little experiment that I do with people. So I take out the pronouns and I put your name and so on. If I personalize this, and I understand because as someone lives in this unforgiveness or lack of showing themselves mercy, it changes your view of you. And I think what's more important than my view of Gary is God's view of Gary. So Romans 5 says this in the Message, 1-3. And I'm just going to change, and I would do this in a counseling setting. So for the lack of this, Jeremy, I'm going to put your name in the pronouns. So by entering through faith into what God has always wanted to do for Jeremy, to set Jeremy right with him, to make Jeremy fit for him, Jeremy has it all together because of his master, Jesus. And that's not all. When Jeremy throws open the door to God, he discovers at that same moment that God has already thrown open his door to Jeremy. Jeremy finds himself standing where he's always hoped he might stand, out in the wide open spaces of God's grace and glory, standing tall and shouting his praises. It's awful hard for us to continue to live in this unforgiveness when we would admit that God's view is much more important and probably more accurate than my view. So when you hear that in that way, Jeremy, what's it make you think?
So it makes me think that, even though I can't or haven't dealt with this forgiveness, this mercy, God already has.
Mm-hmm.
And so I need to get over it, and I need to know that I've been forgiven, and I need to embrace it, revel in it. And to a certain extent, I think I said this probably poorly when I introduced what I was talking about here, but I said God has brought up. I don't know that God's brought it up in my head,
mm-hmm.
but it's maybe me reliving it. It could be the devil trying to bring up my past. It's
to discourage you from the truth we just read.
Exactly. As I think through Paul, he says, when he's talking about putting on and taking off your new life, I think that's the reason he tells us to take off our new life and put on, or
mm-hmm.
take off our old life and put on a new life.
Yep.
Is so that we're not constantly being reminded of these things that have been put to death.
Yeah.
Because these things that we've wronged people with, these things that we've hurt people with, that are in the past, have been put to death when we've received forgiveness from Christ. And I think the devil, Satan, the enemy, tries to continually bring back to life in our minds these things that God has put to death and said, this is no longer who you are.
Which is interesting about that verse in Colossians is he says it 3 times: put away, put off, kill. But he only tells you once to put on. That's because I think it's harder to get rid of those things than it is to put on that. So I think if we'll do a little takeaway in the middle of what we're doing here. If you're listening to this and you're struggling with God's view, your view of God's view of you, and some self-forgiveness, make a list of some of those things that you struggle with, that you haven't accepted or embraced. Then go to Romans 5:1-3 in the Message and take out the pronouns and put yourself in there and realize this is God's view of you. Not your view, but God's view of you. In fact, we've talked before in past podcasts of that verse in Proverbs that says, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. It doesn't say as God thinks about Gary. It says, unfortunately, as Gary thinks about Gary. And I'm infallible and will probably think the worst. So do that as a takeaway. Make a list of those things you struggle with, that you haven't had complete victory with, or, as you said, Jeremy, that the enemy reminds you of to keep you from living a victorious life, and put it in the proper perspective and show yourself some mercy.
And you may not have those things to list out right away, but as they come up, remember that.
Good point.
Yeah. And continue to go back to that.
And if you're married, ask your wife. She'll show you some things you didn't know you had.
This is true. Or your husband may show you wives as well.
Okay, that's fair and equal.
It is fair and equal. So as you embrace mercy, as you desire to be merciful and accept mercy and have mercy bestowed onto you, I think it's important that we do that this week, that we find ways that we can be merciful towards people. When people wrong us, that is the first place that we go, and we desire mercy rather than holding on to these things and letting them become that brick in our bag that we're carrying along, lugging around for who knows how long. Let's put to death those things right away and give forgiveness. And if it means humbling ourselves and allowing that person mercy when they don't deserve it, well, we don't deserve it either. Yep. So that's something that we need to do and to not just do to have it done, but do because we're actually putting it away and we're offloading that baggage from ourselves. Because if you don't do it out of a pure heart, if you don't do it out of a desire to give that person mercy, it's just going to fester and come back.
Yep.
So let's do that. And remember, as you're receiving mercy, as you're trying to forgive yourself or people forgive you, that those things that you have done in the past have been forgiven by someone greater than anyone who might be holding it against you. I just hope that we can do that we can extend mercy, that we can receive mercy, and that we can see lives changed because of it. If you are dealing with something and or you've been working through something and you found the victory of mercy over it this week, we'd love to hear from you. There's a couple different places you can do that. One is facebook.com/RP podcast. We are also on Twitter at the RP podcast, and then on Instagram at RP podcast. If you want to listen to any of our former past podcasts, you can also do that at rppodcast.com/podcast. And we would love to hear from you. We would love for you to listen to any of those old podcasts, and we would love you to become a part of the conversation. So we hope you have a great week. We hope that you can extend mercy, that you can feel mercy, and that you can love well through all of that. And hopefully that this impacts your life as much as I think it has ours this week. So have a great week, and we will see you next time.